It is the year 378 AD. An Emperor Valens of the Eastern Roman Empire has led his legions into Thrace to confront a vast Gothic force under the charismatic war chief Fritigern. Enraged by Rome's cruelty, most notoriously the sale of their children for rotten meat, the Goths are driven not only by vengeance, but also by the hope of securing new lands beyond the reach of Hunnic aggression. For Valens, this rampage is intolerable, and outside Adrianople, both sides prepare for a confrontation that will forever mark the empire's fate. After Julian the Apostate's death in 363, during the Persian campaign, the Sassanids seized the initiative under their formidable ruler, Shapur II. Julian's officers hastily crowned Jovian, whose humiliating peace agreement with Persia cost him legitimacy in the eyes of the Roman populace. He died soon thereafter, and the imperial mantle passed to Valentinian, who promptly appointed his brother Valens as co-emperor. Unlike Julian, renowned for his battlefield prowess, Valens was no natural soldier, having spent most of his life managing family estates. Physically unremarkable and known for his uncertain temperament, he was thrust into a role demanding both diplomatic skill and martial vigor. With Valentinian handling threats in the west, Valens inherited the more perilous eastern frontier. The Sassanids remained his chief concern, but first came an unsettling omen. In July 365, an earthquake near Crete unleashed a tsunami that devastated ports across the eastern Mediterranean, and many Romans viewed it as a sign of divine displeasure with their new emperor. To make matters worse, a usurper named Procopius seized Constantinople, swaying Roman troops to his banner. He even cited an old treaty with the Tervingi Goths to recruit their aid. King Athanaric answered the summons, but before the Goths and Procopius could join forces, Valens's legions defeated the usurper in 2 quick campaigns. By then, some Gothic groups had already crossed the Danube and begun pillaging Thrace. Outraged, Valens retaliated by invading Tervingi lands north of the river. While these expeditions allowed him to claim captives and display Roman resolve, he never managed to corner the main Gothic armies. Finally, in 369, Athanaric agreed to a treaty that abolished any tribute paid to Rome, offering a respite that allowed Valens to focus on the Sassanid threat. He spent the next 8 years consolidating Mesopotamia and Armenia, never suspecting that an even more fearsome crisis was gathering to the north. The trigger for this new upheaval was the arrival of the Huns, a nomadic people who surged in from the vast Asian steppe, crushing the Alans and pushing the Greuthungi Goths westward. Even the Tervingi, under King Athanaric, could not halt the Hunnic onslaught, which drove countless families into desperate flight. Under Alavivus and Fritigern, a large group of Tervingi sought refuge in the Roman Empire, hoping to settle south of the Danube rather than face extinction. Although still wary and busy on the Persian front, Valens permitted their entry in exchange for disarmament. The empire needed soldiers, and Valens preferred granting asylum to facing an uncontrolled crossing. Yet the logistics were appalling. Tens of thousands of Goths needed transport across the Danube, and the empire's vessels proved woefully inadequate. Roman officials like Lupicinus and Maximus exploited the hungry Goths, trading them scraps of meat for slaves. Worse, many Goths, fearing they would be left behind, tried to swim across the river and drowned. The camps on the Roman bank became cesspools of disease and squalor. Matters took a catastrophic turn when the Gruthungi, also fleeing the Huns, arrived at the frontier. Concerned by their ever-increasing numbers, Roman authorities refused them entry, but with nothing to lose, they built makeshift rafts and crossed illegally. Meanwhile, corruption and cruelty in the existing Gothic camps provoked deep anger, which Lupicinus then ignited by inviting the Tervingi leaders to Adrianople and betraying them. Their bodyguards were slaughtered, yet Fritigern somehow escaped or was released. The incensed Goths revolted, armed themselves with captured Roman gear, and annihilated the local garrison sent against them. Discontented peasants, former slaves, and even some Roman troops, frustrated by punitive taxation, joined Fritigern's rising in Thrace, turning it into a widespread rebellion. Valens responded by sending reinforcements west from his war with Persia, while Emperor Gratian, Valentinian's son, dispatched troops under Frigoritus and Richomeres from Gaul and Pannonia. Although these Roman forces cornered some Gothic groups in the Balkan mountains, new barbarian allies, including Huns and Alans, reinforced Fritigern, and by the close of 377, the Romans had effectively lost control of large swaths of Thrace, Dacia, and Illyricum. Gratian's efforts to send more men were delayed by sudden Alemannic attacks on the Rhine frontier, forcing him to recall many of the troops he had initially released. By the spring of 378, with his position in the east growing untenable, Valens left Antioch for Constantinople. The city's populace, already resentful of his Arian Christian beliefs, greeted him with hostility. Determined to salvage the province's security and assert imperial power, he gathered around 15,000 to 20,000 soldiers, though precise numbers remain debated, and marched to Adrianople. Sebastian, one of his officers, had already cleared smaller Gothic bands from the vicinity, but the main horde under Fritigern remained strong. Fritigern intercepted Valens's army near Adrianople. On August 9th, 378, the emperor marched out in crushing summer heat, leaving his baggage and non-combatants within the city. The Thracian plain was bone dry, the air thick with dust and shimmering with midday haze. The Goths had taken a defensive position on high ground near a ring of wagons, their lager, where women, children, and the elderly were sheltered. From there, they could see the Roman columns approach from Adrianople, already fatigued by the day's heat. Eager to avoid an immediate clash until more cavalry reinforcements arrived, Fritigern dispatched envoys under the pretext of renewed negotiations. He supposedly asked that the original agreement for their settlement be honored, and even offered to lay down arms in exchange for guaranteed lands. While these gestures may have contained a genuine offer of peace, they also served to buy time for the Alan and Gruthungi horsemen roaming nearby. Valens' scouts failed to spot the scale of Fritigern's cavalry. The emperor believed he held a numerical edge and saw no compelling reason to concede territory, but he paused to consider Fritigern's entreaties. Smoke and dust drifted across the battlefield as the Goths set fires in front of their position, generating heat and confusion among the Romans. The rising flames further dehydrated Valens's legionaries, who were already exhausted from hours on the march. Officers attempted to maintain discipline and keep the lines in formation, but morale was visibly strained. At some point, elements of the Roman right flank, likely cavalry skirmishers, impatiently rode forward. Whether they intended merely to gain a vantage point on higher ground or to probe the Gothic line, their advance soon escalated into a skirmish. The moment the Roman cavalry made contact, Fritigern's infantry braced for battle, their seasoned warriors roaring war cries meant to disorient and intimidate. Then, with a thunderous charge, Gothic foot soldiers clashed with the overextended Roman horsemen, while the awaited Alan and Gruthungi cavalry thundered in from the wings. Now the Roman right found itself trapped, pinned against Gothic shields in front, battered by barbarian horsemen on the flanks. A few units managed to hold their ground, but many were overwhelmed by sheer weight of numbers and the ferocity of the Gothic charge. Their line collapsed in confusion, sending Roman troopers galloping back into the main body. The shock rippled through the army, just as part of the Roman left flank advanced haphazardly toward the wagon laager. Initially, these Roman riders smashed into the unprepared Gothic defenders near the wagons, almost breaking through. But Fritigern's right-wing infantry and more barbarian cavalry quickly converged, protecting the laager and trapping the Roman horsemen, who could find no effective support from their own infantry. Meanwhile, the main Roman center, still forming up, realized both flanks were rapidly folding under pressure. The legionaries stood shoulder to shoulder, forming a shield wall bristling with spears. A desperate melee broke out, with the Goths slamming their own shields into Roman ranks and hacking at exposed arms and legs. Columns of Gothic warriors surged forward, chanting, while battered Roman troops struggled to respond in the swirling dust and stifling heat. As panic spread, pockets of Roman soldiers began to draw inward, forming a tighter mass that unwittingly made them an easier target for cavalry. Hemmed in, many men could not properly swing their weapons or raise shields in time. The Goths capitalized on every advantage. Their cavalry encircled the Roman lines, cutting off escape routes. The laager, which had initially seemed like a vulnerable point, morphed into a sturdy anchor on the Gothic side, preventing the Romans from making a concentrated push. Step by step, the Roman center, composed of courageous but now exhausted troops, lost cohesion, and entire units broke away. Some of the Emperor's elite formations fought valiantly, hoping to carve a path out of the encirclement. But the swarm of barbarian cavalry and infantry inexorably closed in. Some ancient accounts claim Emperor Valens tried to rally a final stand of elite bodyguards and Palatine troops, but confusion reigned. One version says he was struck by an arrow and carried off the field by loyal men, only to be burned alive inside a peasant's hut when Goths, unaware of his rank, set it ablaze. Another simply reports that he fell in the chaos, never to be identified. Whatever the truth, the outcome was catastrophic for the Roman army. Of the thousands who marched with Valens that dawn, only a fraction escaped. By nightfall, bodies blanketed the field, and the once proud legions of the East were in ruins. In the wake of victory, Fritigern turned his attention to Adrianople. Inside its walls lay the imperial treasury and additional supplies, prizes that would enhance his power. Yet despite attempts at storming or intimidating the city into surrender, the defenses held. Spurred by this frustration, the victorious Goths briefly set their sights on Constantinople itself, but the mighty capital, protected by formidable walls and a garrison supplemented by Arab auxiliaries, proved just as unassailable. Fritigern withdrew his forces into Thrace, Illyricum, and Dacia, plundering towns and countryside where supplies were ample, while the Romans scrambled to reorganize. In the aftermath, Emperor Gratian installed Theodosius as the new Eastern Emperor, but the war dragged on. Roman forces struggled to contain these newly united Gothic armies, and further large battles threatened even more devastation. Eventually, both sides grew weary of fighting. In 382, a formal agreement granted the Goths land in Thrace on the condition that they provide military service to the empire. But the peace was fragile. Among the Gothic ranks would rise a leader named Alaric, who, driven by resentment and ambition, would soon challenge Rome again. The lessons of Adrianople, an entire Roman field army wiped out and an emperor lost, signaled a turning point in imperial history. It revealed the empire's vulnerability to large barbarian forces and foreshadowed the centuries of internal strife and external pressure that Rome would never fully overcome.